On March 14, 1859, 17 physicians gathered inside a locked chamber at the Medical College of South Carolina in Charleston. They had come to witness something that went against everything they believed about the human mind. A 10-year-old enslaved boy, owned by Colonel Edmund Vance of Beaufort County, could solve mathematical problems that took trained scholars hours to complete. He solved them in seconds, entirely in his head. But what disturbed these men wasn't only the speed of his calculations. It was the fact that he was black. And in 1859, that single detail threatened the very foundation of their world. The boy's name was Caleb. Before we continue with his story, a story that 3 institutions tried to bury for over 160 years, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to hear has been hidden in medical journals and private letters for generations. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where this story reaches. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To a cotton plantation where a child's gift slowly became his curse. Beaufort County, South Carolina, stretched along the Atlantic coast like a patchwork of wealth built on human suffering. By 1859, Sea Island cotton had made its plantation owners some of the richest men in America. The Vance Plantation, known locally as Riverside, covered nearly 4,000 acres of fertile land, worked by more than 200 enslaved people. The main house, a large Greek Revival mansion supported by 16 Doric columns, stood on a bluff overlooking the Combahee River. It was a constant reminder of Colonel Vance's place among South Carolina's elite. Colonel Edmund Vance was 53 years old that year. His military title came from his service in the Seminole Wars, not from any recent conflict. He carried himself like a man who believed deeply in natural hierarchies, in a world where everyone had a God-given place. His library was filled with books by Dr. Samuel Cartwright and Josiah Nott, men who claimed that African people were biologically inferior. Vance often quoted these works at dinner parties, using science to justify his wealth, power, and beliefs. Caleb was born on the plantation in late 1848 or early 1849. Like most enslaved children, his exact birth date was never recorded. His mother, Ruth, worked in the main house as a seamstress, a job slightly safer than field work. She had been brought to Riverside at age 15, sold after the death of her previous owner in Georgia. Caleb's father had been sold away before the boy's first birthday. He was shipped to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the life expectancy for field workers was less than 7 years. Ruth never spoke his name again. Silence was the only way she could protect herself from the pain. Caleb's unusual abilities appeared early. Before he could form full sentences, he could repeat entire conversations he'd heard days earlier, word for word, including the exact tone and pauses. The house slaves noticed first, whispering among themselves about the strange child who remembered everything. Ruth tried to hide it. She knew that being exceptional was dangerous when you were considered property. She had seen what happened to enslaved people who drew too much attention. The strong ones were worked until their bodies broke. The beautiful ones disappeared into the master's bedroom and returned changed. The intelligent ones were sold away to harsher places where no one asked questions. So Ruth taught Caleb to keep his head down, to speak softly, to hide his brilliance under quiet obedience. For several years, it worked. Caleb moved through the plantation like a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable. But some gifts cannot stay hidden forever. It was Colonel Vance's youngest son, Marcus, who first discovered what Caleb could do with numbers. Marcus was 14 in 1857, a boy struggling beneath the weight of his father's expectations. His older brother, Edmund Jr., excelled at everything: writing, shooting, academics. Marcus was quiet, clumsy, and far more interested in books than hunting. To his father, that made him a disappointment. His mathematics tutor, a strict man from Charleston named Mr. Coppermith, had no patience for Marcus' struggles. One afternoon in August, frustrated by a difficult problem involving compound interest, Marcus threw his slate onto the courtyard ground where several enslaved children were sleeping. The slate cracked near Caleb, who was about 8 years old at the time. "Stupid numbers," Marcus muttered. Who can calculate 7% compound interest on $4,000 over 9 years? Caleb glanced at the slate for barely 3 seconds. Then he spoke without thinking. $5,835.47, sir. The courtyard went silent. The children stopped sweeping. Marcus stared at Caleb, his face shifting between confusion, disbelief, and fear. Then he grabbed the slate and ran to find his tutor, leaving Caleb standing alone in the sudden quiet. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned with Mr. Coppermith. The tutor looked skeptical, almost amused. "The boy must have overheard you earlier," he said. "He's simply repeating what he heard." "I never solved it," Marcus insisted. "I couldn't. That's why I threw the slate." Mr. Coppermith took a piece of chalk from his pocket and wrote a new problem on the courtyard wall. 347 multiplied by 283. He turned to Caleb. "Well?" Caleb felt his mother's eyes on him from the nearby window. He knew he should pretend not to understand. He knew he should act as though the first answer had been luck. But something inside him, pride, instinct, or simply the inability to hide what came naturally, made him answer. 98,201, sir." Mr. Coppermith worked through the problem on paper. When he finished, his face had gone pale. "Correct." He tested Caleb with 5 more problems, each one harder than the last. Each time, Caleb answered within seconds, his eyes distant, as if he were reading numbers written in the air that only he could see. That evening, Colonel Vance was called from his study. He stood in the courtyard as the sun went down, watching as the tutor tested Caleb with calculations Vance himself could not solve without long work. The colonel said nothing for a long time. When the tutor finished, Vance simply stared at Caleb. And there was something in that stare that made the boy want to run, to hide, to disappear. "How do you do this?" Vance finally asked. Caleb tried to explain, stumbling over his words. "I see the numbers, sir. They arrange themselves. It's like looking at a picture, but the picture is made of numbers that move and connect." Vance waved him away. That night, Ruth held her son in their small cabin behind the main house. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. "You've been seen now," she whispered. "And being seen is the most dangerous thing that can happen to us." For 3 weeks, Colonel Vance said nothing about what he had witnessed. He ran his plantation as usual, meeting guests, checking account books, disciplining slaves. But late at night, he sat alone in his library, wrestling with a problem none of his books could answer. Every medical text on his shelves claimed the same thing: that African people lacked the ability for abstract reasoning, for complex calculation, for the higher thinking that separated civilized men from so-called savages. Yet he had watched a slave child perform calculations faster than educated white men. There were only a few possible explanations. Either everything he believed, everything the South believed, was built on a lie. Or Caleb was some kind of rare exception that proved nothing. Or there was a trick he hadn't figured out. Vance needed to know which one it was. His wealth, his status, and his identity depended on it. He began testing Caleb himself. Night after night, he called the boy to his study. At first, Ruth was allowed to stand quietly in the corner. But after the first week, Vance dismissed her. Caleb entered the study alone, the heavy door closing behind him like a coffin lid. The colonel's tests grew more elaborate. He used advanced math textbooks. He created complicated scenarios involving cotton yields, interest rates, and plantation expenses. He read long chains of numbers and demanded Caleb repeat them backward. He even tried trick questions with no solution at all. Through it all, Caleb remained accurate. His answers came with the same speed, the same calmness. He described the numbers as shapes, as colors, as patterns forming solutions in his mind. But what began to disturb Vance more than Caleb's abilities was his emptiness. The boy showed no pride when he was correct. No fear when he was uncertain. No reaction at all to Vance's growing frustration. It was as if Caleb had learned to make himself hollow. A vessel for numbers, but nothing else. Ruth noticed the change. Each night when Caleb returned, he was more withdrawn. She asked what the colonel wanted. "Numbers, Mama," he said. "Just numbers." But his eyes held something else. A wary awareness far beyond his years. A knowledge that he had become valuable in a way that made him less safe, not more. The other enslaved people noticed too. They whispered about Caleb when the overseers weren't near. Some felt proud. Here was proof they were not what the white men claimed. Others were frightened, knowing Caleb's gift could bring danger. A few felt jealousy, wondering why this one boy had been born with something special while they all suffered the same. An older woman named Temperance, who worked in the kitchen, pulled Ruth aside one morning in December. "You need to make that boy stupid," she said bluntly. "Make him forget those numbers before the colonel decides he's worth more as a curiosity than as a worker." "I can't," Ruth whispered. "He can't help what he knows, any more than he can help breathing." "Then God help you both," Temperance replied. "Because I've seen what happens when masters get too interested in one of us. It never ends well." Her warning would soon prove true. In January of 1858, Colonel Vance made a decision. He would demonstrate Caleb's abilities to select members of Charleston's medical community. Not publicly, he understood that would be dangerous. But privately, to a carefully chosen group of physicians whose opinions held weight. If they could confirm that Caleb's abilities were real, it would give Vance the validation he needed. And if they could explain Caleb's talent in a way that did not threaten the racial order the South depended on, even better. The invitations were sent in mid-January. They were worded carefully, promising a demonstration of unusual mental phenomena, without revealing the race of the subject. Vance wanted the doctors to arrive without assumptions, to witness Caleb's abilities first, before their prejudices kicked in. Among those invited was Dr. Nathaniel Crawford, a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina and a strong believer in polygenism. The theory that different races were actually different species, created separately by God or nature. Dr. Crawford had published several papers claiming that the African brain was incapable of abstract reasoning, that its skull structure prevented higher cognitive functions. He had built his entire career on these beliefs, and defending them had become part of who he was. Also invited was Dr. Thomas Aldrich, an older Charleston physician with 30 years of experience. Unlike Crawford, Aldrich had learned humility. He had seen enough in his long career to know that the world did not always fit neatly into theory. The third key guest was Dr. Harrison Webb. He was young, only 31, and had recently returned from medical studies in Europe. There, he had encountered ideas that had not yet reached the American South. He had read European papers describing people with extraordinary mental abilities. Calculating prodigies, individuals with perfect memory, people who saw numbers as colors or shapes. These cases existed among all races and all social classes, suggesting that such abilities were quirks of the brain, not proof of superiority. The examination was set for February 7, 1858, at the Riverside Plantation. Vance wanted the demonstration on his own land, where he could control every detail. The night before, Ruth barely slept. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to Caleb breathe, wondering if this would be their last night under the same roof. She had heard stories of enslaved people with unusual abilities who were sold to traveling shows, or taken north by curious scientists, or who simply disappeared and were never heard from again. What if these doctors wanted to take Caleb away? What if they convinced the colonel to sell him? Vance was a businessman before anything else. If the price was high enough, he would sell anything, even his own shadow. Ruth thought about running. She imagined taking Caleb into the night, following the drinking gourd north like so many before them. But she was a seamstress, not a field hand. She didn't know the land. She didn't know which stars to follow, or which white faces might help them, and which would turn them in for a reward. And Caleb was too young, too small, to run fast or far. They would be caught within days. The punishment for escape was brutal. So she did the only thing she could. She held her son close and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The physicians arrived at Riverside in the early afternoon. 6 men in total, dressed in formal black coats and stiff collars that marked them as professionals. Colonel Vance welcomed them into his drawing room, offering brandy and cigars. He made polite conversation about Charleston society, the weather, and politics. He wanted to set a tone, making sure they saw him as their equal before he revealed the true purpose of their visit. When he finally explained that the subject of their examination was a slave child with extraordinary calculating abilities, their reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical. Some were curious. And a few exchanged glances that suggested they suspected they were about to witness a parlor trick. Dr. Crawford's face immediately showed skepticism, almost bordering on disdain. Dr. Aldrich leaned forward with interest. Dr. Webb stayed neutral, observing quietly. The other 3 physicians exchanged glances, as if they suspected they had been brought to witness some kind of trick. Marcus entered the room with Caleb, who had spent the last hour being washed, groomed, and dressed by Ruth. Caleb wore clean clothes, the kind that marked him as house property, not a field worker. A white cotton shirt, dark trousers slightly too large for him, and no shoes. His hands were scrubbed clean, his hair trimmed short. He looked even younger than 9, small, thin, and tense, with his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The room fell silent the moment he entered. There was a heavy discomfort in the air, an unspoken tension Caleb could feel without fully understanding. These men had agreed to examine a slave. But now they were staring at a child, nervous, fragile, and clearly powerless. Some of them, despite themselves, felt a flicker of shame. Dr. Crawford cleared his throat. "Well, Colonel, shall we begin?" The first tests were simple. Dr. Crawford read out large numbers, asking Caleb to add and subtract them. Caleb answered correctly each time, quickly, but not so fast that it seemed unnatural. Crawford's expression tightened as he checked each answer. So far, Caleb had made no mistakes. Then the tutor moved to multiplication. 3 digits by 2 digits. Then 3 by 3. Then 4 by 3. Each answer came within seconds. The physicians double-checked Caleb's responses with pencil and paper, taking minutes to confirm what the child solved instantly. Every answer was correct. Dr. Webb finally spoke. "How do you arrive at these answers? Can you explain what you see?" Caleb hesitated and glanced at Colonel Vance, who gave him a slight nod, permission to speak. "I see the numbers, sir," Caleb said softly. "They look like pictures, but not pictures exactly. Each number has a shape and a color. Small numbers are bright. Big numbers are darker. When you ask me to multiply, the numbers move toward each other. When they meet, they make new shapes, new colors. The strongest color is the answer." The room went still. Dr. Crawford's face darkened. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "Numbers don't have colors. The boy is confused, or pretending. This is deception, or evidence of some kind of mental defect." Dr. Webb answered calmly. "On the contrary, this description appears in European medical literature. Some individuals experience numbers, sounds, or even words as colors or shapes. The cause is unknown, but the phenomenon is real." "European literature," Crawford muttered. "Those physicians are too liberal in their thinking. Too willing to entertain fantasies." He turned sharply toward Caleb. "We're here to determine whether your abilities are real, or whether your master has been tricked by clever memorization." Caleb lifted his head. "Then give me something I couldn't have memorized." Every head in the room snapped toward him. Enslaved children did not speak unless spoken to. They did not challenge white men. They did not show courage, or anything that could be mistaken for defiance. Colonel Vance's face hardened with anger. But before he could speak, Dr. Aldrich stepped in. "The boy is right. If we want to rule out memorization, we must give him something completely new." Aldrich pulled a pocket watch from his vest. "It is currently 2:47 in the afternoon. How many seconds have passed since midnight? Caleb's eyes went distant for 5 seconds. 57,420 seconds, sir. Dr. Aldrich took nearly 3 minutes to verify the answer on paper. When he finally looked up, his entire expression had changed. Correct. The examination continued for another 2 hours. The physicians took turns presenting increasingly difficult challenges. Long division with huge numbers. Compound interest calculations over many years. Geometric problems requiring spatial reasoning. And even a memory test, reciting 30 random digits backward. Caleb did every task flawlessly. Throughout the demonstration, Colonel Vance watched his property perform. His expression gave nothing away, but inside, he was wrestling with conflicting emotions. Pride, that he owned something rare and valuable. Anxiety, over what these doctors might conclude. And beneath it all, a deep, unsettling fear. That perhaps everything he believed about racial hierarchy, everything he built his world on, was not as certain as he thought. Dr. Crawford grew increasingly irritated. Every test he created to expose fraud only proved the boy's abilities were even greater. Finally, his patience snapped. Colonel Vance, he demanded, how many hours have you spent training this boy? How much instruction has he received in mathematics? None, Vance replied calmly. He cannot read or write. He has never been inside a school. Until 3 months ago, I did not know he could count past 10. Impossible, Crawford said flatly. A child cannot reach this level without years of training. Someone must have taught him. Who? Dr. Webb stepped in. Colonel Vance runs a plantation, not a school. Who would teach an enslaved child advanced mathematics? And why? Silence filled the room. The question had no answer. The examination ended with no agreement among the physicians. Dr. Crawford left insisting that some kind of deception had to be involved, even though he couldn't explain what form that deception took. Dr. Webb, on the other hand, wanted more testing. He believed there was a real phenomenon behind Caleb's abilities. Dr. Aldrich admitted openly that he had witnessed something he simply couldn't explain with current medical knowledge. As the doctor's carriages rolled down the long oak-lined driveway, Colonel Vance stood on the porch with his hand on Marcus's shoulder. What do you think we proved today? He asked his son. Marcus, who had watched the entire examination from a corner of the room, thought for a long time before speaking. I think we proved Caleb is smarter than all of them, he finally said. And I think that scares them. Vance's hand tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to warn. Never say that again, he said quietly. Not to me. Not to anyone. Do you understand? Marcus nodded. But the look in his eyes said he had already understood more than his father wanted him to. That night, Ruth held Caleb as he trembled with exhaustion and a fear he couldn't name. What happens now, Mama? He whispered. She had no answer, none that wouldn't make things worse. So she held him closer and hummed an old song her mother used to sing before Ruth was sold away from her family. What happened next was both predictable and terrible. Word of the examination spread through Charleston's medical community. Even though Vance tried to keep it private, the story grew with every retelling. A slave child who could outthink trained mathematicians. A child whose abilities contradicted the racial science the South depended on. Some doctors dismissed the story as plantation gossip. Others were curious. And Dr. Crawford, feeling his reputation threatened, launched a campaign to discredit everything. In March 1858, he published a letter in the Charleston Medical Journal. He carefully described the examination in a way that made it sound flawed, and he suggested that Caleb's abilities were nothing but a clever trick. He even implied that Ruth might have been involved in some form of deception. The letter sparked replies. Dr. Webb wrote a rebuttal, pointing out that Crawford's explanations didn't match what all 6 physicians had seen with their own eyes. Dr. Aldrich added his voice as well, explaining that he had created several test problems on the spot, problems Caleb could not have prepared for. Charleston's medical world split in two. Some doctors saw Caleb as an extraordinary case study. Others saw him as a dangerous threat to the theories that justified slavery. And a few saw opportunity. If this child truly had such abilities, what else could be learned from him? In April 1858, Colonel Vance received a letter from a physician in Boston named Dr. William Garrison. He had no relation to the famous abolitionist, though his name alone raised suspicion. Dr. Garrison politely requested permission to examine Caleb under controlled scientific conditions. But the meaning was obvious. Northern science wanted to weigh in because Southern science couldn't explain what it had witnessed. Vance burned the letter in his fireplace. He didn't need Northern interference. He didn't need Yankees using his property to argue for racial equality. The country was already unstable. Kansas was erupting in violence, Washington was in turmoil, and South Carolina's leaders were openly talking about secession. The South did not need a slave child who disproved everything its society was built on. Vance made a decision. There would be no more demonstrations. No more examinations. No more attention. Caleb would stay at Riverside. He would remain a private curiosity, seen only by those who already knew. For months, this worked. The controversy in the journals faded. Life at the plantation returned to its usual rhythm. But Caleb had been seen, and being seen changed everything. Other enslaved people kept their distance. Some viewed him with awe. Others with quiet resentment. To them, his gift made him different, separate, a dangerous thing to be. The overseers watched him more closely, suspicious of any slave who drew the master's attention. And Marcus, the colonel's youngest son, developed an obsession. Marcus had always been the disappointment. The quiet boy. The one who preferred books to guns. The one who would never measure up to his older brother. But he was still a Vance. Still a white boy raised to believe he was superior to every black person around him. Caleb's abilities shattered that belief. How could someone who was supposed to be inferior solve problems Marcus couldn't even understand? Marcus began seeking Caleb out when no one was watching. At first, he simply tested him with more problems. But over time, something darker grew inside him. He began giving Caleb impossible questions, hoping to finally prove that the boy had limits. But Caleb kept answering correctly. Marcus's frustration twisted into anger. One afternoon in June 1858, Marcus found Caleb alone in the stable. "Calculate this," he demanded, spitting out a complicated problem. Caleb solved it in seconds. Marcus's face flushed red with humiliation. "You're cheating," he snapped. "You have to be. My father's books say your kind can't think like this." Caleb knew he shouldn't respond. But something inside him, tiredness, fear, or a spark of defiance, made him lift his eyes. "Maybe the books are wrong, sir." Marcus slapped him so hard Caleb fell to the ground. The stable spun around him. His ears rang. "Don't you ever suggest that I'm wrong," Marcus hissed. "Your property. You exist because we allow you to. You think you're special because my father finds your tricks entertaining? You're nothing. Remember that." He walked away, leaving Caleb on the stable floor with blood trickling from his nose. Caleb didn't tell his mother. What good would it do? Marcus was the master's son. Reporting him would only bring more trouble. But something changed in Caleb that day. He realized that his gift wasn't dangerous simply because it made him valuable. It was dangerous because it challenged the lies these white people told themselves about who they were. And people whose beliefs are threatened can be capable of anything. The summer of 1858 was brutal. The heat lay heavy over Beaufort County. The cotton fields swallowed the days of hundreds of enslaved workers who labored from dawn to dusk. Caleb stayed mostly inside the main house, spared from field work but not from labor. He helped his mother sew, ran errands, cleaned, polished, and tried, more than anything, to stay invisible. But Colonel Vance had not forgotten him. If anything, the controversy in Charleston only made Colonel Vance more interested, more determined, to understand the nature of what he owned. He continued calling Caleb to his study several nights a week, challenging him with increasingly obscure problems. Sometimes these sessions lasted for hours. Caleb would leave exhausted, his mind stretched thin, like fabric pulled too tight. Vance began taking notes during these sessions, writing down Caleb's answers, recording Caleb's explanations, and observing the boy's reactions. He never explained why he was doing this. Maybe he believed these notes would one day become valuable. Maybe he thought they would help him argue his case in a future debate. Or maybe he simply needed to organize something that deeply unsettled him. One night in August, after Caleb solved a complicated problem involving logarithms, a topic he had never been taught, Vance set down his pen and looked at the child for a long, silent moment. "Do you understand what you are?" he finally asked. Caleb kept his eyes on the floor. "I'm your property, sir." "Beyond that," Vance said. "Do you understand how unusual you are? How rare? I know I can do things with numbers that others can't, sir." Vance leaned back. "Do you know what those physicians argued about after examining you?" Caleb hesitated. He had heard the debate, but he wasn't supposed to understand that the question was whether someone like him could possibly be as intelligent as someone like them. "No, sir," he said. "They argued," Vance continued, "about whether you're a curiosity or a threat. Whether you confirm the rules, or whether you break them." He paused, then added quietly, "I haven't decided which explanation troubles me more." Those words frightened Caleb more than any threat ever could. It meant that even Vance, the man who owned him, did not know what to do with him. Uncertainty in a master was far more dangerous than certainty. Certain masters had predictable rules. Uncertain ones were capable of anything. "May I ask a question, sir?" Caleb whispered. Vance raised an eyebrow but nodded. "What will happen to me?" The colonel stayed silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "That depends on many things. On what conclusions the medical world reaches. On how useful your abilities prove to be. On whether the political situation stabilizes or collapses." He looked directly into Caleb's eyes. There was something almost like regret there. "I won't lie to you, boy. Being special makes you valuable, but it also makes you vulnerable. There are men who would pay large sums to own you. Others would want to study you. And some would prefer you simply stop existing because you challenge what they believe." He lowered his voice. "My advice is this: stay quiet, stay useful, and hope that this storm the nation is heading into resolves itself before anyone decides you're worth fighting over." It was the most honest thing any white person had ever said to Caleb. And it was terrifying. That night, Ruth found Caleb sitting in their cabin, staring into nothing. "What did the colonel want?" she asked. "Numbers," Caleb answered automatically. Then, after a moment, "Mama, what happens to valuable slaves?" Ruth froze, her hands still on the shirt she was mending. "What do you mean, baby? You told me being seen was dangerous. But being valuable, is that different? Or is it worse?" She set her sewing down and pulled him close. "Listen to me," she said. "Some slaves are valuable because they're strong. They get worked until they break. Some are valuable because they're beautiful. They get used until they're used up. And some are valuable because they're unusual. Those ones get sold to traveling shows, or to rich men up north who collect people like trophies." Her voice dropped. "And sometimes they just disappear. Someone decides they're too unusual, too troubling, and they vanish in the night. Is that what will happen to me?" Caleb whispered. "Not if I can help it," Ruth said fiercely. "But you need to understand something. The only thing protecting you right now is that the colonel hasn't decided what you're worth. Whether you're worth keeping, or selling, or silencing." She cupped his face in her hands. "So you stay quiet. You stay useful. And you pray that whatever storm is coming passes before it hits us." And the storm was coming. By the fall of 1858, the national debate over slavery had reached a breaking point. In October, Senator William Seward delivered his famous irrepressible conflict speech, declaring that America would eventually become either all slave or all free. Charleston's reaction was immediate and furious. Newspapers filled with warnings about Northern aggression and Southern rights. Planters across Beaufort County spoke openly, not about if the South should secede, but when. Colonel Vance found himself pulled deeper into these political undercurrents. His peers demanded he take a stand. He was expected to defend Southern institutions, to prove Southern superiority, to uphold the belief system that justified slavery itself. Caleb became a symbol in this debate, a living contradiction. In October 1858, Dr. Crawford published a more aggressive article in the Charleston Medical Journal. This time, he didn't just question Caleb's abilities, he blamed Northern influence, accusing Southern physicians of being corrupted by abolitionist thinking. Dr. Webb responded with his own article, but by then the debate had moved beyond science. Northern newspapers picked up the story, using Caleb as proof that enslaved people had intellectual abilities equal to whites. Southern newspapers fired back, calling the whole thing abolitionist propaganda. Caleb, the child himself, was no longer the focus. He had become a political symbol. Colonel Vance received letters from everywhere. Some offered enormous sums of money to purchase Caleb. A theater operator in Philadelphia wanted to put him on stage. A wealthy collector in New York wanted to bring Caleb north for scientific study, which Vance recognized as an attempt to steal him. Southern doctors wanted further examinations to disprove or diminish his abilities. Vance refused every offer, but the pressure kept building. Then, in January 1859, a letter arrived from a group calling themselves the Charleston Scientific Society. They wanted one final, comprehensive examination. This time at the Medical College of South Carolina, in a lecture hall designed for public scientific demonstrations. The letter was signed by 12 physicians, including Dr. Crawford and Dr. Webb. Despite their disagreements, they had united on one thing. The controversy needed to be settled. Not for Caleb's sake. Not for the truth. But because the case had become politically dangerous. South Carolina was moving toward secession. The fire eaters were gaining power, and South Carolina was moving steadily toward secession. The last thing the state's scientific community needed was a public argument about whether a slave child's mind could challenge the racial theories that justified their entire society. One final examination. One definitive conclusion. Then Caleb could be pushed back into obscurity, and everyone could choose whatever version of the truth served them best. Vance agreed. The examination was scheduled for March 14, 1859. The weeks leading up to that day were some of the most tense Ruth had ever lived through. She didn't know the details, but she knew what was at stake. Whatever happened in that room would decide her son's fate. Whether he stayed at Riverside, whether he was sold away, or whether he vanished like so many enslaved people who became inconvenient to powerful men. She had no rights, no protection, no one she could appeal to. All she could do was pray and prepare. She made sure Caleb ate well, slept enough, and stayed healthy. She reminded him constantly. Be respectful. Answer clearly. Show no pride. Show no fear. And never appear defiant. She taught him how to be both remarkable and invisible. To display his gift, while appearing less than human to the men who wanted to judge him. Caleb understood something important was coming. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes Ruth would find him sitting alone, staring into space. And she wondered what kind of calculations he was running. Not numbers, but possibilities. Risks. Fears. How do you calculate the probability of survival when you are a valuable piece of property in a world that needs you to be worthless? On March 12th, Colonel Vance announced they would leave for Charleston in the morning. Ruth was not invited. She would remain at Riverside while Caleb traveled with Vance and Marcus. That night, Ruth held her son until he fell asleep. She memorized the weight of him in her arms, the rhythm of his breathing, the smell of his hair. She didn't know if she would ever hold him again. The journey to Charleston took almost the entire day. Caleb sat beside Marcus, facing backward in the carriage, watching Riverside shrink into the distance. The plantation was the only place he had ever known. It was a place of pain, but a familiar pain. Charleston was something else entirely. And he had learned early that the unknown was usually worse. They arrived in the evening and checked into the Charleston Hotel, a grand waterfront building that catered to wealthy planters. Caleb was not allowed in the main section of the hotel. He was kept in a small servant's room near the kitchen, watched by one of the hotel's enslaved workers, a man named Peter. Peter was curious but cautious. "Heard you can do things with numbers," he said. Caleb said nothing. Talking about his abilities only brought trouble. "They got you in some kind of trouble?" Peter asked. "I don't know yet," Caleb admitted. Peter nodded. "That's the truth for all of us, ain't it? We never know we're in trouble until it's too late." The next day passed slowly. Caleb was not allowed to leave the hotel. He sat in the small room, watching the light change in the window, waiting for whatever was coming. He tried not to think about his mother, or whether he would ever see her again, or what would happen if he failed in ways he couldn't predict. Evening came. Morning followed. And then, on the afternoon of March 14th, Colonel Vance arrived at the door. "It's time," he said. They walked through Charleston streets, Caleb following a few steps behind Vance and Marcus. The city was beautiful, so beautiful it made his chest ache. Grand homes with iron balconies. Churches with tall steeples. Gardens full of flowers he had never seen. All built on the suffering of people who looked like him. The Medical College of South Carolina stood on Queen Street, an imposing brick building, one of the most respected medical schools in the South. Vance led Caleb through a side entrance, up a set of stairs, and into a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and something darker. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door labeled Lecture Hall 3. Then Vance did something so unusual that it frightened Caleb. He knelt down to look the boy in the eyes. "Listen to me," Vance said quietly. "Whatever happens in that room, answer truthfully. Show them what you can do." "Yes, sir," Caleb whispered. "These men want to settle this question and move on. Give them what they need. Be remarkable, but not threatening. Competent, but not proud. Can you do that?" Caleb understood exactly what he was being asked to do. Be impressive, but not too impressive. Be valuable, but not dangerous. Walk a line so thin that one wrong answer could destroy him. "I'll try, sir." Vance stood, placed his hand on the door handle, and opened it. The lecture hall was built like an amphitheater, with rows of seats rising high above a central demonstration area. 17 men sat watching him, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, hostility, and forced neutrality. A single wooden table sat in the center. Medical diagrams lined the walls, drawings of bodies reduced to systems and organs, people turned into specimens. Caleb walked down the steps, acutely aware of every eye on him. Vance and Marcus sat in the front row. The door closed behind them with a heavy echo. Dr. Crawford stood and descended into the center. He carried several sheets of paper covered in calculations. "Let us begin," he announced. "The subject before us is the property of Colonel Edmund Vance of Beaufort County. His name is Caleb, approximately 10 years old." He turned to the child. "You will answer every question asked of you. You will explain your methods when requested. If you answer incorrectly or refuse to cooperate, it will be recorded. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Then let us proceed." What followed was unlike anything Caleb had ever experienced. This was not a demonstration. This was an interrogation, systematic, relentless, designed to expose either the limits of his ability or the mechanics of any supposed fraud. The physicians took turns, each trying to outdo the last with problems more complex than the one before. They began with arithmetic. Huge numbers added, subtracted, multiplied, divided. Caleb answered quickly and correctly. They moved to fractions, decimals, and multi-step word problems. He solved all of them. They tested geometry, algebra, ratios, and proportions. He stayed accurate. He explained his process when asked, how numbers appeared to him as colors and shapes, how patterns formed in his mind before he even realized he was solving anything. Some of the physicians took notes. Others whispered to their neighbors. Dr. Crawford's face grew redder with every correct answer, his questions becoming sharper, almost hostile. Caleb answered each one calmly. After 2 hours, Dr. Crawford called for a break. The physicians gathered in small groups around the lecture hall, debating what they had seen. Caleb was left alone at the central table. Not allowed to leave. Not offered water. Not offered food. Just waiting. As if he weren't a child at all, but an object under inspection. During the break, Dr. Webb approached him. He looked at Caleb with something close to sympathy. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Caleb was so surprised that he didn't answer at first. No one had asked him how he felt since this whole ordeal began. "Tired, sir," he finally said. Webb nodded. "I imagine so. Caleb, what you are showing today is extraordinary. There are only a handful of people in the entire world who can do what you do with numbers. That makes you rare. But it also makes you." He paused, searching for the right word. "It makes things complicated. Do you understand?" "I think so, sir." "I hope you do," Webb said quietly. "Because what happens after today depends entirely on how these men choose to interpret what they've seen. And men have a remarkable ability to twist evidence into whatever supports what they already believe." Before Caleb could respond, Dr. Crawford called everyone back. The second phase of the examination was about to begin. This time, the physicians had agreed on a different strategy. They wouldn't just test what Caleb could do. They would try to discover how he did it. Or where his ability finally broke. Dr. Samuel Henderson, a mathematician from South Carolina College, took charge. He carried advanced mathematics textbooks, books meant for students years older. The first problem he gave Caleb was a quadratic equation. 32 plus 7x, 12 is equal to 0. Solve for x. Caleb stared at the symbols on the slate. This wasn't like the earlier problems. This required understanding something he had never been taught. He had never seen algebra before. But as he stared at the equation, something shifted in his mind. The numbers and letters formed patterns. The equation wasn't just numbers, it was a balance. And Caleb could see where that balance existed. He could see the values that made the equation true. X equals 1 1/3, he said slowly. Or x equals -3. Henderson worked through the problem using the quadratic formula. It took him several minutes. When he finally looked up, he was pale. "Both answers are correct." A murmur rippled through the lecture hall. Dr. Crawford stood abruptly. "That is impossible. The boy has never been taught algebra. He cannot understand the symbolic reasoning required." "I created this problem last night," Henderson said firmly. "I showed it to no one. The boy could not have seen it before." "Then explain how he solved it," Crawford demanded, his voice rising. "If he cannot explain algebraic principles, how did he arrive at the answer?" Caleb spoke quietly. "I don't understand the formula, sir, but I can see where the equation balances. The symbols have positions and weights. I see where everything has to be for the equation to equal 0. "That is nonsense," Crawford snapped. "That is intuition, not reasoning. Real understanding requires..." "Requires what?" Dr. Webb cut in. "Requires formal education. Requires being white." The room fell silent. "The boy is demonstrating a form of mathematical intuition we do not understand," Webb continued. "But that does not make it any less real, or any less remarkable." "It makes it meaningless," Crawford shot back. If he is simply producing answers without understanding the principles, he is no different from a machine. A curiosity, not intelligence. Dr. Aldrich rose. Gentlemen, we are losing focus. We came here to determine whether this child's abilities are genuine. I believe we've established that they are. The mechanism may be unclear, but the results cannot be ignored. But Crawford wasn't finished. He stepped into the center of the room, his face dark with anger. Or perhaps fear. Fear of what this child implied. I have one more test, he said. One that will show whether we're seeing true intelligence, or just clever pattern recognition. He took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. The problem was long and complex, involving multiple steps in advanced reasoning. No one else saw the paper. When he finished, he read it aloud. You have 3 workers building a wall. Worker A can finish it in 6 hours. Worker B can finish it in 4. Worker C can finish it in 3. They all start together, but worker C stops after 1 hour. How long to finish the wall? It was a trap. A layered problem designed to confuse. But as Crawford read, Caleb's mind broke it down automatically. He saw each worker's rate as a fraction. He saw how the fractions changed when one worker stopped. The answer formed in his mind like a shape appearing out of fog. 2 hours and 9 minutes, sir, Caleb said softly. Or more precisely, 2 hours, 8 minutes, and 34 seconds. Crawford worked through the problem on paper. The room was silent. 3 minutes passed. 4 minutes. He finally set his pen down. The answer is correct. Down to the second. The lecture hall erupted. Some argued this proved Caleb had real mathematical reasoning. Others insisted it proved nothing, only that he was a human calculating machine. Crawford stood frozen, staring at the child with a look that made Caleb want to disappear. Finally, Colonel Vance rose and lifted his hand for silence. Gentlemen, we have been here for more than 4 hours. The boy has answered every question. He has not failed once. I believe we have seen what we came to see. Dr. Crawford turned toward Vance, his voice tight. What we have seen is an anomaly, an exception that proves nothing. This child may have an unusual talent, but it does not challenge the accepted facts of racial science. The African brain remains, in general, inferior in abstract reasoning and higher intellect. Silence fell over the hall. Dr. Webb spoke from behind him. If you were so certain this meant nothing, he said, then why insist on this examination? Why gather 17 physicians? Why spend an entire afternoon testing a child? Crawford had no answer. At least not one he could say out loud. He needed Caleb to be a fraud. Because the alternative was too dangerous to everything he believed. The examination ended shortly after that. The physicians filed out in small groups, most of them still arguing. Dr. Crawford left without speaking to anyone, his face tight with anger he could barely contain. Dr. Webb paused to speak with Colonel Vance. Caleb couldn't hear what they said. Dr. Aldrich gave Caleb one last look before leaving. A troubled look, as if he had witnessed something that unsettled everything he believed. When the lecture hall was finally empty, except for Vance, Marcus, and Caleb, the colonel stood silently for a long moment. Then he turned to the boy he owned and said, "You did well. Better than I expected." It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. And somehow, acknowledgement was worse. Because it meant Vance truly understood how unusual Caleb was. And that meant the danger was far from over. That evening, they returned to the Charleston Hotel. Caleb was placed back in the tiny room off the kitchen and told to wait while Vance attended to business. He sat alone in the growing darkness, exhausted beyond anything he had ever felt. It wasn't only the hours of questioning. It wasn't only the strain of solving problem after problem. It was the weight of being looked at, examined, debated, as if he were a specimen under glass rather than a tired child who wanted his mother. Peter, the enslaved hotel worker assigned to watch him, brought food, bread and stew Caleb barely touched. "Heard you impressed the doctors," Peter said. Heard you did calculations nobody else could do. Caleb said nothing. That good or bad for you, you think? I don't know, Caleb whispered. I don't know what happens now. Peter nodded slowly. We never do we? We just wait and hope it's not the worst thing. They stayed in Charleston for 3 more days. Vance met with physicians, business associates, and men from Beaufort County. Caleb wasn't allowed in any of the meetings. He was simply kept nearby, in case someone requested another demonstration. No one did. Whatever had been decided at the examination, it was enough. On March 18th, they returned to Riverside. Ruth was waiting. Her face was tight with fear that loosened only a little when she saw her son alive and unharmed. That night, she held him in their cabin and asked what had happened. Caleb told her about the examination. The questions, the arguments, the way the physicians had looked at him. I think they were trying to decide if I'm real, he said. If what I can do is real. And what did they decide? Ruth asked. I don't think they decided anything. Some believe. Some don't. None of them know what it means. Ruth was quiet for a long time before asking the question that had been haunting her. Baby, what do you think the Colonel will do with you now? Caleb had no answer. The answer came sooner than either of them expected. In early May 1859, Colonel Vance summoned Caleb to his study. But this meeting was different. There were no textbooks, no papers, no slate. Vance simply told him to sit. Another shocking gesture for a slave child. And began speaking in a calm, almost conversational tone. The physicians haven't reached a consensus, he said. Dr. Crawford has published yet another article insisting your abilities are exaggerated or meaningless. Dr. Webb defended you, but his voice doesn't carry much weight in Charleston anymore. Northern sympathies are dangerous to express. He paused. Dr. Aldrich has stayed silent publicly, though I'm told he writes about you privately. Vance studied Caleb's face as he continued. The controversy hasn't disappeared. It's been buried. South Carolina is preparing for secession. War is likely coming. The last thing anyone wants is debate over questions of racial capacity when unity is needed. Caleb didn't fully understand the politics, but he understood the important part. He was becoming a problem. So here's what will happen, Vance said. You're going to the fields. Caleb's stomach tightened. Not as punishment, Vance added. As protection. If you're just another field hand, you stop being a topic of debate. You become invisible again. And invisibility. He paused. Is the safest thing any of us can be in dangerous times. Will I see my mother? Caleb asked. She will remain in the main house. You'll see her on Sundays. That's all I can allow. It was a sentence disguised as protection. Caleb understood. But he also knew he could not refuse. One more thing, Vance said. Don't use your abilities in the fields. Don't calculate. Don't solve. Don't draw attention. The overseers don't know about you. I'd like to keep it that way. Just be ordinary. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Caleb said. Though he didn't know how someone could hide something that lived inside their mind. The next morning, he was dressed in rough homespun clothing and sent to join the cotton crews. Within days, his hands cracked and bled. The sun beat down mercilessly. The work was endless, repetitive, and brutal. Caleb kept his head down. Kept silent. Kept his extraordinary mind hidden beneath forced mediocrity. Ruth watched from the windows of the main house, powerless. Her hands sewed fine fabric while her mind stayed with her son in the heat of the fields. Summer 1859 passed. The cotton harvest was abundant. One of Vance's most profitable seasons. Autumn brought political chaos. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry sent shockwaves across the South. Newspapers filled with warnings of abolitionist plots and northern aggression. Through it all, Caleb worked the fields. His body grew stronger. His hands hardened. And his gift, the gift that had once amazed Charleston's finest physicians, lay hidden beneath the surface of his life. But he still saw the numbers. At night, lying exhausted on the rough wooden planks of the field quarters, he closed his eyes and watched calculations bloom behind his eyelids. He couldn't stop it. It was who he was. And the world. A world that insisted someone like him could not exist. Had no idea what to do with a mind like his. In November 1859, Ruth managed to send him a message. 3 simple words written on a scrap of cloth. Stay alive. Hope. It was all she could give. It was everything. The year 1860 brought even more tension. Lincoln's election in November triggered exactly what everyone feared. South Carolina seceded in December. 6 more states followed. The Confederacy was formed. War became inevitable. Colonel Vance raised a company of infantry with his cotton profits and left for Virginia with 83 men, including his eldest son. Marcus stayed behind, now learning to run the plantation, learning the power and cruelty required to maintain it. By April 1861, the war had begun. Fort Sumter fell to Confederate forces. The Union naval blockade tightened around South Carolina's coast. Riverside Plantation continued operating, but the world around it was changing fast. The old certainties, the ones men like Colonel Vance had trusted their entire lives, were beginning to crack. And then, in November 1862, everything collapsed. Union forces captured the Sea Islands as part of the Port Royal expedition. Beaufort County fell under Union occupation. The Vance family fled almost overnight, taking whatever they could carry and abandoning the plantation they had run for 3 generations. For Caleb, now 13, and for Ruth, the collapse came suddenly. One day, they were enslaved, owned, controlled, defined entirely by the will of others. The next day, those owners were gone, and the world had no clear rulebook for what came next. Freedom arrived as chaos. Union officials, missionaries, and teachers poured into the Sea Islands to begin what became known as the Port Royal experiment. They conducted censuses, opened schools, and tried to help formerly enslaved people build independent lives in a world that had never allowed them to choose anything for themselves. A northern teacher named Elizabeth Babcock arrived near what had once been Riverside Plantation in January 1863. She meant well, but she understood little about the people she hoped to help. In her journal entry from February 14, 1863, she wrote, "Today, I met a youth, perhaps 13 or 14, whose mother said he had unusual skill with numbers. When I tested him, he solved complex arithmetic mentally with remarkable speed. He said he had been examined by physicians in Charleston years before, but no one could give details. The next day, when I returned to arrange schooling for him, he and his mother had already left. Other freed people said the boy seemed frightened of attention, as if he'd learned that being remarkable brought danger. I could not find them again. And at that moment, the trail goes cold. Ruth and Caleb disappeared into the vast movement of freed people searching for safety. No one knows where they went. No one knows if Caleb ever found a place where he could use his extraordinary mind openly, without fear. A brief mention in the Charleston Mercury in June 1867 describes a colored youth performing fast calculations for coins near the Market Street docks. The writer mocked him, claiming many destitute young men pretended to have been examined by doctors to gain sympathy. Whether that was Caleb, or simply someone borrowing his story, no one can say. Dr. Harrison Webb survived the war and returned to his medical practice. He never published anything more about Caleb. But in 1875, when a younger colleague asked him about the boy, Webb reportedly said, "We witnessed something that didn't fit our understanding of the world. Instead of changing our understanding, we stopped looking. That failure haunts me more than any patient I ever lost." Dr. Nathaniel Crawford continued teaching until his death in 1871. He never wavered in his belief that racial hierarchy was scientifically proven. His ideas would later be recognized as pseudoscience designed to justify injustice, but in his lifetime, they were considered respectable scholarship. He died still insisting he had been right. Yet he never fully dismissed the possibility that Caleb had been genuine. In his final publication, he wrote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when such evidence challenges fundamental principles, skepticism remains the proper scientific posture." Dr. Thomas Aldrich lived until 1879. His private journals, discovered in the 1930s, contain multiple entries about Caleb. One passage from 1876 stands out. "I often think of the boy we examined that March afternoon in 1859. I watched him solve problems requiring true mathematical reasoning. I heard him describe processes we do not possess the vocabulary to explain. And I watched my colleagues, men trained in observation, reject what they saw because accepting it would require rethinking beliefs they had built their careers upon. We called it science, but it was cowardice. We saw a human mind performing wonders, and chose instead to focus on the color of the skin containing that mind. I wonder what he might have achieved had he been born white. I wonder how many minds like his were destroyed because our society needed them to be ordinary. We had evidence that should have changed us. We chose comfort over truth. And I will answer for that failure when judgment comes." The Medical College of South Carolina's official records contain only a single line about the event. March 14, 1859. Special lecture on unusual mental phenomena. Demonstration of calculating ability in a subject of African descent. Inconclusive findings. Inconclusive. One word. Buried in dusty administrative records. Summarizing an event witnessed by 17 physicians. An event that sparked months of debate. An event that challenged the scientific foundations of an entire society. Not inconclusive because they couldn't determine if Caleb's abilities were real. Every physician in that room had watched Caleb solve every problem correctly. They had verified his answers. They had searched for any trick, any illusion, any sign of deception. They found none. So why did they call it inconclusive? It wasn't because they lacked evidence. It was because accepting that evidence would have unraveled the moral foundation of their entire society. It was easier, safer, to record the matter as inconclusive than to admit what they had really seen. Easier to protect their theories than confront uncomfortable truths. Easier to let one child disappear into obscurity than to acknowledge that millions of enslaved people might possess abilities their system insisted they could not have. So what really happened to Caleb? We will never know for certain. The historical record goes silent, the same way it does for so many formerly enslaved people whose lives were never considered important enough to document. Maybe he survived the chaos of war and Reconstruction. Maybe he found peace somewhere far from Charleston, living quietly with a gift he could never safely reveal. Or maybe he became another casualty of a world that had no place for someone like him, lost to disease, violence, or poverty before reaching adulthood. But here's what we do know. In March of 1859, a 10-year-old enslaved boy displayed mathematical abilities that 17 trained physicians witnessed firsthand. Abilities they could not explain. Abilities that contradicted the very theories they used to justify slavery. And instead of letting those abilities change their assumptions, they buried the truth. They labeled it inconclusive. They moved on. These men weren't necessarily evil. They were products of their world, men who believed in systems that gave them comfort and protected their social power. But they had a choice. And they chose theory over evidence. Comfort over truth. Belief over observation. Choices like that, repeated again and again across generations, created a world where children like Caleb had to hide their brilliance just to stay alive. A world where being remarkable was dangerous. A world where genius could get you killed. Caleb's story is not just about an extraordinary mind. It's about how institutions, especially those that claim scientific authority, will reject anything that threatens their power. It's about how entire systems can be built on prejudice instead of truth. And it makes us wonder, how many other Calebs were there? How many brilliant lives were smothered because the world refused to see them? And here's the part we cannot ignore. When we ignore evidence because it makes us uncomfortable. When we cling to beliefs that protect our pride. When we reject truths that challenge our worldview. We repeat the same mistake those Charleston physicians made in 1859. We choose comfort over reality. What do you think of Caleb's story? Do you believe his abilities were real? Or do you think the physicians missed something? More importantly, have we actually learned anything from failures like this? Or are we still ignoring evidence that challenges our assumptions? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story made you think, if it moved you, if it made you angry, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten stories that were buried because they were too inconvenient to remember. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Because the most dangerous thing we can do is forget. Forget that extraordinary human beings were treated as property. Forget that science was twisted to defend injustice. Forget that uncomfortable truths were labeled inconclusive and filed away. We can't change the past, but we can refuse to repeat it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.